This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning. We want to go straight to the Senate floor. Democratic Senator Al Franken responding to calls for his resignation.
I felt that we had entered an important moment in the history of this country. We were finally beginning to listen to women about the ways in which men's actions affect them. The moment was long overdue. I was excited for that conversation and hopeful that it would result in real change that made life better for women all across the country and in every part of our society. Then the conversation turned to me. Over the last few weeks, a number of women have come forward to talk about how they felt my actions had affected them. I was shocked. I was upset. But in responding to their claims, I also wanted to be respectful of that broader conversation, because all women deserve to be heard and their experiences taken seriously. I think that was the right thing to do. I also think it gave some people the false impression that I was admitting to doing things that, in fact, I haven't done. Some of the allegations against me are simply not true. Others I remember very differently. I said at the outset that the Ethics Committee was the right venue for these allegations to be heard and investigated and evaluated on their merits, that I was prepared to cooperate fully, and that I was confident in the outcome. You know, an important part of the conversation we've been having the last few months has been about how men abuse their power and privilege to hurt women. I am proud that during my time in the Senate, I have used my power to be a champion of women, and that I have earned a reputation as someone who respects the women I work alongside every day. I know there's been a very different picture of me painted over the last few weeks, but I know who I really am. Serving in the United States Senate has been the great honor of my life. I know in my heart that nothing I have done as a senator, nothing, has brought this honor on this institution. And I am confident that the Ethics Committee would agree. Nevertheless, today I am announcing that in the coming weeks, I will be resigning as a member of the United States Senate. I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party. But this decision is not about me. It's about the people of Minnesota. And it's become clear that I can't both pursue the Ethics Committee process and at the same time remain an effective senator for them. Let me be clear. I may be resigning my seat, but I am not giving up my voice. I will continue to stand up for the things I believe in as a citizen and as an activist. But Minnesotans deserve a senator who can focus with all her energy on addressing the challenges they face every day. There is a big part of me that will always regret having to walk away from this job with so much work left to be done. But I have faith that the work will continue because I have faith in the people who have helped me do it. I have faith in the dedicated funny, selfless, brilliant young men and women on my staff. They have so much more to contribute to our country. And I hope that, as disappointed as they may feel today, everyone who has worked for me knows how much I admire and respect them. I have faith in my colleagues, especially my senior senator, Amy Klobuchar. I would not have been able to do this job without her guidance and wisdom. And I have faith, or at least hope, that members of this Senate will find the political courage necessary to keep asking the tough questions, hold this administration accountable, and stand up for the truth. I have faith in the activists who organized to help me win my first campaign and who have kept on organizing to help fight for the people who needed us. Kids facing bullying, seniors worried about the price of prescription drugs, Native Americans who have been overlooked for far too long, working people who have been taking it on the chin for a generation, everyone in the middle class, and everyone aspiring to join it. I have faith in the proud legacy of progressive advocacy that I have had the privilege to be a part of. I think I've probably repeated these words 10,000 times over the years. Paul Wellstone's famous quote, "The future belongs to those who are passionate and work hard." It's still true. It will always be true. And most of all, I have faith in Minnesota. A big part of this job is going around the state and listening to what people need from Washington. But more often than not, when I'm home, I am blown away by how much Minnesota has to offer the entire country and the entire world. The people I've had the honor of representing are brilliant and creative and hardworking, and whoever holds this seat next will inherit the challenge I've enjoyed for the last 8.5 years, being as good as the people you serve. This has been a tough few weeks for me, but I am a very, very lucky man. I have a beautiful, healthy family that I love and that loves me very much. I'm going to be just fine. I'd just like to end with one last thing. I did not grow up wanting to be a politician. I came to this relatively late in life. I had to learn a lot on the fly. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fun. And I'm not just talking about today. This is a hard thing to do with your life. There are a lot of long hours and late nights and hard lessons. And there is no guarantee that all your work and sacrifice will ever pay off. I won my first election by 312 votes. Could have easily gone the other way. And even when you win, progress is far from inevitable. Paul Wellstone spent his whole life working for mental health parity, and it didn't pass until 6 years after Paul died. This year, a lot of people who didn't grow up imagining that they'd ever get involved in politics have done just that. They've gone to their first protest march or made their first call to a member of Congress, or maybe even taken the leap and put their names on a ballot for the first time. It can be such a rush to look around a room of full of people ready to fight alongside you, to feel that energy, to imagine that better things are possible. But you too will experience setbacks and defeats and disappointments. There will be days when you will wonder whether it's worth it. What I want you to know is that even today, even on the worst day of my political life, I feel like it's all been worth it. Politics, Paul Wellstone told us, is about the improvement of people's lives. I know that the work I've been able to do has improved people's lives. I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. For a decade now, every time I would get tired or discouraged or frustrated, I would think about the people I was doing this for and would get me back up on my feet. I know the same will be true for everyone who decides to pursue a politics that is about improving people's lives. And I hope you know that I will be fighting alongside you every step of the way. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
And with that, the news. The Democratic Senator Al Franken is resigning his seat in the Senate in the coming weeks on a day he calls the worst day of his career. He said that he has never brought dishonor on the Senate, responded in some measure to those calls from 8 different women who accused him of sexual misconduct in the coming weeks, saying that all women deserve to be heard, but saying that he believes, in some of those cases at least, that the allegations were not true. In others, that he remembers them differently, but nevertheless, he is resigning because he feels he cannot serve the people of Minnesota, the people who elected him, while an ethics committee investigates. He also went on in that speech to call out both President Trump and Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore of Alabama, who are also facing sexual misconduct allegations, denying them, noting the irony as he steps down, they remain in office. I want to go to our team right now, starting with our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, there on Capitol Hill. We heard the senator's explanation right there, somewhat defiant, not all that contrite in the statement, saying his entire career would be worth it. Clearly, he wanted to stay in the Senate, Mary. But yesterday, after another accusation from an anonymous source, it was simply impossible. The floodgates open from his Democratic Senate colleagues.
Yeah, George, Franken made it abundantly clear that he does not feel his actions warrant his resignation here today. But what was also abundantly clear is that he has lost the support of his colleagues here. Yesterday, we saw a tidal wave of his fellow Democrats coming out and saying enough is enough, that he had to resign. It did come after that latest allegation, those accusations coming out against him. And we saw a handful of women senators really driving this, coming out in what appeared to be a coordinated push, saying he had to resign. And then we saw in less than 24 hours now, at least 39 senators who agreed with that, including the Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, who is incredibly close with Al Franken, but has spent a very difficult last 24 hours personally pleading with him to do what he just did here and step down.
Let me bring in our chief White House correspondent, John Karl, as well. As I said, John, Al Franken calling out the president there as well. The president had been critical of Senator Franken on Twitter, even as he defends Roy Moore. So what you have now is both Al Franken and Democratic Representative John Conyers resigning, setting up a clear contrast with some Republicans.
A clear contrast. And what struck me about listening to Senator Franken is he really does not seem to have think that he did anything wrong or anything significantly wrong, but he pointed out what he called the irony that the president, in his words, has admitted on tape to committing sexual assault, and he firmly believes that Senate candidate Roy Moore, possibly on his way to the U.S. Senate, is guilty of things far worse than anything that Franken has admitted to or even been accused of. He noted that irony, and there is quite a contrast here. One significant thing here that you might say he has in common is no real admission of doing anything wrong. The president adamantly insists he did nothing wrong, called that Access Hollywood tape locker room talk, and Roy Moore is denying now that he did anything wrong in terms of sexual misconduct towards underage girls.
Also, our senior national correspondent, Tom Yamas, you've been down in Alabama for the last several weeks covering this campaign. This is going to be an interesting moment now as this election comes up on Tuesday. As John pointed out, Roy Moore and the president simply absolutely deny in the face of several women accusers as well. And one of the things we've seen is a shift among the Republican senators. They started out saying Roy Moore has to get out of the race. There's no way he can serve. They're starting to come around to the idea that he's going to be serving.
And I think it's going to be bigger than the Senate. This race down in Alabama, George, just got so much bigger. Because if Roy Moore wins, a man who's accused of sexually inappropriate behavior with 8 women, almost all of them teenagers, and sexually assaulting 2, he has denied those allegations. But if he wins this Senate race, he goes to the U.S. Senate, and every Republican who's up for election is going to be asked the same question. Do you stand with Roy Moore? Now, this is a very big issue. The news cycle moves so fast right now. But this issue has proven not to go away. The midterms only 11 months away.
And very likely he will end up in the Senate Ethics Committee, where Al Franken now will not be investigated. But the news for today, Senator Al Franken, Democratic senator of Minnesota, is resigning in the wake of sexual misconduct allegations. Our coverage is going to continue online. Of course, the full report tonight on World News with David Muir. And you can get the latest breaking news anytime by downloading the ABC News app. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi, everyone. Amna Nawaz here, continuing coverage now of the breaking news we all just watched unfold. Democratic Senator Al Franken of Minnesota has announced he will resign from the U.S. Senate in the coming weeks amid multiple accusations of sexual misconduct and a growing chorus among his own Senate colleagues to do just that. Let's go live now to Washington, D.C. My colleagues Rick Klein, ABC's political director, and Mary Alice Parks were watching Al Franken's statement from down there. Rick, let's just start with this. What sort of stood out to you about the way Franken chose to make that announcement just now?
He was not contrite really at all, and in fact saying he felt like he could weather these accusations, and I think it was more of a nod to the cultural moment we're in, and him recognizing that he could not do his job effectively as a result of this. I think also the timing of this is interesting. The fact that he's not stepping down immediately means that Democrats will have some time to get their ducks in a row. He also stays in the Senate during a critical time, a whole bunch of votes coming up later this week and this month on government funding and taxes and the like. I also think there was one line in there where he referenced that Minnesota deserves a senator who can apply all of her energy. And I think that was maybe a nod to the Governor Dayton about who he should select. But more broadly, that to me was the closest that he came to contrition. But to me, this was Al Franken saying, I'm going away, but I'm not going away quietly.
Let's go over to Capitol Hill for just a second. Our chief congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce, is there with us now. Mary, one of the things people are going to be wondering as they watch that announcement and hear the news is why now? The allegations have obviously been out there for a number of months now, at least 2. So what happened that led to this announcement today?
Well, for weeks, Democrats have argued that this should be handled through the regular process here, that this should go through an ethics investigation. Franken himself was saying that he was willing to comply with all of that, but the allegations have simply been piling up. And yesterday morning, after we saw yet another anonymous accuser come out, a small group of women senators here said, you know what, enough is enough. And we saw this really coordinated push that forced open the floodgates, really, and forced other senators to have to go on the record as well. And in the span of less than 24 hours, you now have 39 senators, the majority of Democrats, saying they agree that Franken had to go, including the Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, who is incredibly close with Al Franken, something of a mentor to him up here on the Hill. He, too, behind the scenes was trying desperately to urge Franken to step aside. And you cannot ignore the overarching movement here, but also the political climate, which is, of course, Roy Moore. And there is a Moore effect here. Democrats are going to try, it seems, to seize the moral high ground here. And in order to do that, I think they need to show that they have dealt with these instances where their own lawmakers, their own congressmen and senators have been accused of this kind of behavior. And you are also seeing, of course, a big push up here from many Democrats and some Republicans to change the way that these kinds of accusations are handled, to increase transparency and accountability here on the Hill when it comes to how staffers and others may bring forward these kinds of issues.
John Karl, our chief White House correspondent down there in D.C. Of course, Al Franken is a Democrat, but he used his speech down there to take a swing at a couple of Republicans while he was talking. I want to play one quick bit of sound for you and then just get your take on the back end. Here's just a quick excerpt from Al Franken's speech on the Senate floor just moments ago.
But I know who I really am. Serving in the United States Senate has been the great honor of my life. I know in my heart that nothing I have done as a senator, nothing, has brought this honor on this institution. And I am confident that the Ethics Committee would agree. Nevertheless, today I am announcing that in the coming weeks, I will be resigning as a member of the United States Senate. I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Calls for him to resign came from both sides of the aisle, but this step today, announcing that he would resign before there's any kind of investigation, does this make it more difficult for Republicans who face similar accusations to not step down?
I think Republicans are in a tough spot anyway regarding Roy Moore. So many of them are on the record saying that his behavior is simply unacceptable, that he's not fit for the United States Senate. But what was striking in listening to Senator Franken is his firm conviction, his firm belief, his firm statement that he does not believe that he did anything wrong, certainly not while he was a United States Senator, and even casting doubt on any of the allegations against him, saying most of them are simply not true, and that those that where there may be some truth, he recollects in a much different way. So in Franken's view, and you can hear it in his voice, as well as in his words, but in the tone of his voice, his firm view is that while he is forced to resign, somebody who is guilty, who is far worse than anything that he has even been accused of, sits in the Oval Office and may well, another person may well be elected to the United States Senate with the full support of his Republican colleagues. But I do believe that if Roy Moore, in fact, wins that Senate race next Tuesday, there will be a major push to take him before the Senate Ethics Committee. Mitch McConnell is still saying that is something that he would face, and a very tough vote for Republicans to take, whether or not to throw him out after the voters of Alabama have elected him, fully aware of the charges against him, or whether or not to allow somebody to serve in the Senate that's been accused of sexual misconduct towards underage girls.
Mary Alice Parks over in the D.C. Bureau. John Karl raises a really good point there that at the beginning of his remarks, Senator Franken basically said, look, of all the allegations, some of them are simply not true, and of others, I just remember them differently. There wasn't a single sentence in his statement there that gave any sort of solace or apology or admission of any wrongdoing to any of the 8 women who've accused him.
Not at all. And he struggled because he wanted to give voice in some way to the movement. He said that he believed this conversation across the country taking place was a good thing, an exciting thing, that he hoped it would spur change, a cultural change, both on Capitol Hill and businesses. And so he really was struggling to, in some ways, say he wanted to believe women, that he wanted to champion women. But when it came to himself and the accusations against him, you're exactly right. No admission, no acknowledgement that he had done something wrong.
And John Karl, this larger sort of cultural reckoning that is obviously going on, we've seen men in positions of power across a number of industries immediately taken down because of either the wave of allegations or the proof of the allegations or just the sheer severity of the allegations. But for the most part, men in position of power in politics have been immune to much of this. Do you think that the steps taken by Representative John Conyers and Senator Franken, does that change the equation in Washington?
Well, it was a first. We saw two significant figures in the Democratic Party actually now resigning. John Conyers being one of the longest-serving members of Congress in American history, one of the most powerful Democratic members of the House. Also, by the way, somebody emphatically denying the charges against him, but forced to resign because he simply had no further base of political support. The leadership in his own party telling him he had to resign. And Al Franken, not as powerful or long-standing a figure as John Conyers, but a Democrat of significant standing, somebody who had even been talked about as a potential presidential candidate in 2020, again, denying the charges against him, but forced to resign because he simply had lost the support of his own party. I mean, now the big question is going to be what happens with the Republicans, and I think that's not an accident. I think that the Democrats will make this contrast and will make it aggressively. What happens to the Republicans? They have a president of the United States who has been accused of sexual misconduct towards a long list of women. Somebody who said what he said on that Access Hollywood tape. Is he going to be held to account? And what happens with their Senate candidate, who now has the support of the RNC, but still does not have the support of many other Republicans in Congress? What happens if Roy Moore actually wins and is elected to the United States Senate? How do they hold him accountable? Do they hold him accountable?
And Mary Bruce over on Capitol Hill, it's not just what happens next with Republicans, but also with Democrats. Al Franken there, Senator Franken, not giving a timeline exactly about when he will resign, but if he leaves, what happens to his seat?
Well, if he does leave in the coming weeks, as he said he would, well, then the governor has to appoint someone to fill that seat. And it does, from sources that we've talked with, seem that it's likely that the lieutenant governor might be a top candidate here. You did hear Al Franken mention her when discussing someone who may replace his seat, perhaps a nod in that direction. But to the point that John Carl was getting at, which is such an important one, right? This now becomes a huge question for Republicans going forward. And we're actually going to jump downstairs here any minute and try and talk with some of those Republicans, because the question for them will be, if you thought Al Franken had to go, what about Roy Moore? And is there a double standard here? If you feel that Franken's behavior was somehow disqualifying, well, if Moore is elected, what next? And many have said, well, the ethics committee should handle that. But clearly, by coming out so forcefully against Franken and, quite frankly, against Congressman Conyers, who resigned earlier in the week, Democrats have now set something of a precedent. And it will be up to Republicans to see if they are going to hold themselves to that same kind of standard. And it, of course, comes as we've seen this remarkable shift in the Republican Party. Leaders and others who originally, called for Moore to go, now saying it's up to the people of Alabama. But once he gets here, what will the people in these halls do?
Rick Klein, big picture here now. Look, obviously all allegations of sexual misconduct or assault are not equal. We're talking about a range of accusations and a range of allegations across all these people on Capitol Hill. But I'm curious what you think about how this is handled moving forward now. Does this become sort of a battle for the moral high ground?
I think it's a battle for the moral high ground where no one looks particularly high. And that's the problem with trying to hash this out. You mentioned every case is not created equal, and I think that's an important piece of context. I also think it's important that the accountability here is not meted out in equal measure. And suffering consequences for bad behavior, I think anyone can agree with that. But it's not clear what you do when you're talking about elected officials. They set their own accountability standards, and it's going to be up to individuals. So I think the Democrats have put out a new, more clear precedent that they hope is followed, but they don't have control over that. As the last couple of weeks have shown, you don't get to control how a duly elected member of Congress handles him or herself. And in the case of Roy Moore, Republicans tried to get him out, and now they're rallying back behind him. So it's still going to be one by one, a case by case. But I think what's going on here is Democrats trying to do two things. One is to demonstrate some clarity and say, when we have a problem in our ranks, we take care of it. And secondly, recognize to the broader public that's having this discussion at home, we get it. We are part of this Me Too movement. It has to mean us as well. And I think that's the demonstration that you're seeing, maybe more powerfully than anything around partisan lines, is that recognition that this is not happening in a vacuum when you're talking about powerful men in powerful positions abusing that power.
And Mary Alice, isn't it also true, when you look at it, whatever moral authority or standard is being set here by people in the highest offices of the land, when it comes down to, as Rick says, case by case, you look at the election that Roy Moore is running in and coming up next week now, it's going to be up to the voters to decide whether or not these kinds of things really matter to them or not.
Absolutely going to be up to the voters in Alabama. Voters across the country will need to decide whether they believe the women when these allegations come up in future campaigns, whether they are willing to accept admissions and apologies when those come up down the road. But I also think at some point, like any large institution, Capitol Hill is going to have to develop some processes and some procedures for handling this. That's been a big part of this conversation, that staff and interns felt like they didn't have a way to talk about issues of harassment, didn't have any avenue for recourse, and they're going to have to find a way to whether it is actually going through with an ethics investigation, sort of systems that they put in place to help people that felt victimized. We are going to see, I'm sure, Capitol Hill really putting procedures in place and on the books, because while things will be done on a case-by-case basis, I agree with that, it can't just be ad hoc here on out.
Mary Alice Parks, Rick Klein, live in the D.C. Bureau. Thanks, guys. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Amna.
Thanks, Amna.
Thanks also to John Carl and Mary Bruce for joining us earlier. Thanks to you for watching as well. Head over to abcnews.com and get the latest on today's breaking news. Senator Al Franken of Minnesota announcing he will resign from the U.S. Senate in the coming weeks. Download the ABC News app. Get all the breaking news right to your phone. For now, I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.